Greene is a collection of short stories written by 26 authors associated with the English program at Southampton Solent University. What you're about to hear are a small selection of these stories, told within the very special town of Greene. The stories you're about to hear will be presented in the way they have been discovered. By all accounts, these stories are fiction. They shouldn't exist.
It's that time of day yet again, folks, where the sun always shines and the cockerel's always on time. Today, on Where the Grass is Always Greyer, we'll be uncovering strange, new and macabre mysteries from our beloved Greene. This being our 114th episode since our initial broadcast, we have decided that today's theme will be Now You See Greene, Now You Don't. But first, the news from our favourite reporter. You will fear him, you will love him. It's the host of the most, Mr. Greene. Why, thank you, Mr. Greene. In today's top stories, after closing 1 week ago, the supermarket chain, Gainsbury's, keeps its doors sealed after an anonymous April Fool's prank claimed the lives of countless shoppers. Within days, the cleanup crew mysteriously vanished, but despite their job's sake, they have left more mess than when they came in. We believe that these cleanup crews are working in conjunction with the perpetrator, who still remains at large and has yet to be caught. But we here at GGBS remain optimistic about cleanup crew number 14 and wish them luck in their endeavour. Always remember, folks, your gas mask is optional. You do not have to wear it. A local restaurant owner who goes by the name of Darren has been missing for 19 days and 9 hours counting. Some sources claim that it was the work of his fellow employees who committed the crime, but after speaking with such nice, petite, and dainty young women, we have concluded that they have no connection to the crime. To those of you listening, if you have any information regarding Darren, please contact us at 114-114-199. Poor Darren. Poor, stupid, hideous, repulsive, loathsome Darren. Today, a very special resident has moved into Greene. Though we've tried wheeling him in, the man by the name of Howard Gnarly has yet to respond to us. That doesn't mean we haven't responded to him.
We're watching you, Gnarly.
Welcome once again, listeners. It is I, Mr. Greene, and we've got a very interesting story to share with you. Have you ever been inside a household that gives you the heebie-jeebies? Because we sure know someone who has. Howard Gnarly. Abandoned property is certainly an eyesore that's plaguing our poor town, as unfortunately, some of our residents do decide to relocate. As if Greene isn't enough for them. One day, a home is busying with mother, dearest, looking after the children, and father heading to and fro from work. Even old Rover is chasing his tail around the garden. Go, boy, go! And then... nothing. The building lies empty and abandoned. It's as if no one was living there at all. This story was submitted to us by a rising star in the Greene community, Rita Santiago, who has titled this trivial tale, The Murderer's House.
The wind was howling, and rain started to fall. Howard raised his hand, touching his already soaked hoodie, and fastened his pace. He was still lost, and had not seen anyone around town, no cars passing by, no sound at all. The only thing he could hear were his own footsteps and the raindrops hitting angrily against his hoodie. Far in the distance, he spotted a fast food restaurant, with its light signs still flickering, cars still parked outside. Howard raised his head and looked at the dark sky, questioning once again how he had got to that creepy and strangely cold place. There was no answer. Another house appeared at the corner of the road. It looked empty just like the other ones, so he decided he would get inside to shelter himself from the rain. The door opened with no effort, like it had never been locked. The smell of mold, of a place that had not seen the sunlight for years, invaded Howard. Particles of dust were clearly the only inhabitants of the house. He noticed the dust and the emptiness, but he also noticed that everything was still in place, like everyone suddenly vanished, but left everything behind. There was an empty living room, with just a sofa and a coffee table, with big hands all over the place, an empty pizza box, and what seemed like a pair of girls' jeans. Howard looked around and spotted a picture on the wall. It was a picture of a woman smiling with a small boy that did not look so happy. Through the window, Howard watched the rain, that looked like it would not stop soon. He would have to wait inside, so he decided to just lay on the sofa and rest. As soon as he sat down, he felt something hard behind one of the pillows. He picked it up and looked at it. It was a diary. He thought he could entertain himself a little bit and just read. Leafing through, Howard found only 2 pages written. Not in the beginning of the diary, but in the middle, with a terribly scrawny handwriting. His reading echoed through the empty house.
January 6th. It was dark. My shoes hit the sidewalk as quietly as possible, as the girl I had been stalking around disappeared into the dark corner of the road. I knew she was headed home after her shift at the town's local fast food restaurant, where she barely earned enough money to eat. I also knew her small apartment would be empty. No one would be waiting for her at the end of another day. I fastened my pace in her direction and grabbed the rock firmly in my hand. When I was right behind her, she didn't seem to notice my presence, keeping her attention on her phone screen. I thought about going back and letting her go, but I needed to do it. She needed someone to put her out of her misery. I knew what that felt like. With a quick action, I covered her mouth with my hand and smashed the rock against the back of her head, making her unconscious body fall on my arms. Her phone fell from her hand and hit the concrete, making a cracking sound. Her helplessness and the smell of fresh blood coming from her head mixed with the smell of fried food against my nose, giving me a sense of comfort. The previous ones didn't smell so good. I took her keys from my pocket and carried her inside her apartment, making sure no one was around. I laid her body carefully on the sofa, placing my hand on the back of her head so that blood would not go into the fabric. She was so peaceful. No one could help her, not even God. There's no such thing as God. He never helped me either. That's why I was going to help her. I took her clothes off and looked at her. She was beautiful. I knew she had an ex-boyfriend that used to treat her so badly, so I would make that better for her too. I lay my body next to hers, able to hear her heart beating. I felt her warmth, and I felt her soul. My rage grew stronger, remembering my life was even worse than that girl's life, and I wanted to make her suffer. I did it so harshly and deeply that her eyes opened. I liked it. She tried to scream and I ended up covering her mouth again, feeling her soft lips against my palm. She was sobbing and struggling to breathe. I dragged her into the bathroom and made her take some sleeping pills she had in the drawer. I counted them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. People who believe in God say it's the number of perfection. I told her not to be scared and made sure she swallowed all 7 of them. I sat on the floor holding her tired body and caressed her hair gently. She would be better in no time. I was making it all better for her. She wouldn't feel anything. She was out on the bathroom floor. I turned on the tap and watched the water flow. As for me, I was at peace once again. My eyes looked one last time in her direction, and I smiled.
Howard swallowed hard, got up, and left the house.
And you're joining us again, folks, for the latter half of The Grass is Always Greyer. And hosting the show is always the fan favourite. He's lean, he's keen, he's on every TV screen, it's Mr. Greene. Thank you. In today's news, unorthodox practices have been reported to have been adapted within the local church community. It was only yesterday when citizens noticed something unusual about the priest who maintains the premises. Why, yes, the good father was leaving naked and bare for all the respectable public to see were his untied shoelaces. What unholy blasphemy! We here at GGBS will get right to the bottom of this and make sure that this sacrilegious act is rectified at once. That we will guarantee. In other news, church members have been fashioning razor blades into crucifixes. This is normal. Marigold Manor, otherwise colloquially known as the Sortie House, has been assaulted once more by none other than Greene's rebellious rascals. Held by the Sortie family for generations, the building is a reminder of those who laboured to get us where we are today. But some people cannot seem to understand that. It's disgraceful, really, how the youth have so little concern for their elders, However, we here at GGBS, and myself personally, don't blame the children, but rather their parents, and their parents' parents, and their parents' parents' parents, and their parents' 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 parents. We will be keeping an eye on who enters. And now a word from our sponsors.
This is a quick announcement from the Greene Community Council. As Article 88, all individuals with the initials
HG
must report to the local authorities for questioning. Those with similar initials, such as GH or 44 Delta, should report to the nearest police officer for further instructions. We do this because we care. About Greene, and you, and them.
Are you seeing a growing bump in your stomach? Looking for a quick way to lose some of those sudden progressing pounds? Try Madame Burton's Detox Slimming Corset. Just slip into one of these beauties and you'll be losing extra weight in no time. Simply slip in and slip out as that unprotected accident disappears down the drain. Available in sizes normal, somewhat normal, and seemingly normal. Also available in the limited swimsuit edition, so your figure will be liberated from those unwanted sizable squatters when you're relaxing under the grey-green sun.
Gentlemen and ladies, ever found your standard razors aren't getting that up-and-close shave you desire? From Mr. Todd's Shaving Emporium comes the new and improved Straight Razor, guaranteed to cut half a dozen throats before the blade dulls.
Wasn't that delightful? Within this segment, listeners should avert their gaze, as we'll be exploring Greene's most iconic of buildings, the public house. Now some callers in, mothers especially, ask me,
Mr. Greene, you're such a shining example to my child. When they listen to you, I never need to parent them.
which is when I blush. Why, shucks. But they add,
Though you're such a perfect role model, we must ask, do you dare touch the devil's nectar?
well, Maureen, if I'm to be honest with you, yes, I do. Though I do maintain my gentlemanly composure in doing so, there are those temptations to tipple into a bubbling gin every now and again. I recommend doing so yourself. In fact, you should invite the children. They'd love it. Keep them drinking, Maureen, and never stop. Which brings us to a story sent in by Alex Lewis, a student, a writer, and an aficionado for tall tales. As are we.
It was a quaint British pub Howard found himself in, as he opened the door and walked inside. It was only a small place. Howard estimated it couldn't have held more than 50 customers at a time, and half of them would have had to stood since there was even less chairs to go around. A few chairs were in pieces, scattered across the place, one leg in the middle of an unfinished pool game, seemingly acting as a makeshift queue. Howard wondered when that table was last used, and who leaves a game unfinished, as he walked to the bar looking for a bartender to pour him a drink. Honestly, anything would have been perfect for him at this moment. Howard sat on one of the upright stools and placed his hands together, looking around for a sign of company. A flight of stairs led up to the next floor.
Hello?
Howard said, raising his voice. There was no response. He sighed and motioned to get up to pour himself a drink before he heard the raspy voice of an elderly man.
I always enjoy the new folk who arrive here.
The old man said, walking around the stairs.
Those looks of bewilderment when they try to piece together what is happening to them. You are certainly taking it better than most men, my friend. Not too long ago, I saw a man so terrified I thought he was going to die for a second time. An impressive feat, although not impossible in these here parts.
He was dressed in a tweed coat that was surprisingly neat, looking as new as the day it had been bought. He had a grey stubble lining his face, and his short cropped hair was one of the same colour. He walked over to the bar and sat himself on a stool, down the bar from Howard.
You've been here a while then?
Howard said, attempting to manage a conversation. He was conscious of wanting to order a drink, but there was still no signs of any bartenders to serve him.
Just get it yourself.
The man said, sensing Howard's desire to drink.
And I will have a beer while you're there. One of the lighter ones, please.
Howard swung from his stool and walked to the edge of the bar. As he lifted the bar flap, the old man answered his question.
I believe so. Time is an oddity in this place. I try not to think about it too much. What have you been doing since you got here?
The man paused and gestured for Howard's name, who gave it to him.
Not a whole lot.
Howard said truthfully.
I've been talking to folks and heard stories. It's been a strange day.
Did they tell you the one about the writer?
The old man asked.
Nope, no writers.
Well then, son, if I may be so bold as to add to your treasure trove of stories with one of my own, one I acquired under my belt many a moon ago. The people of this here town know it well, but they know I tell it best. It would be my pleasure to tell it to you if I may.
In this time, Howard had chosen his beer, served the old man one, and retaken his seat at the bar.
Go for it,
Howard said. The old man nodded, and then hesitated, as though trying to find the right words.
As I said, it is a story that is all about a writer.
The writer reached out and pulled down his laptop screen, almost violently. He stood up and moved to his shelves filled with books, displayed in such an order that lacked organization or even a moment's thought to a systematic structure. On one shelf was a bottle of whiskey, decades old, and 2 glasses stacked haphazardly next to it. The writer opened the bottle and poured himself a glass. This was his reward that was a long time coming. He strutted across the room, drink in hand for a few minutes, thinking to himself. His study door opened and his wife walked in. "You finished it?" she asked, almost incredulously as she came up to him. It had almost been 5 years at this point since the writer had started his work. The writer grinned, raising his glass to indicate that her guess was correct. The wife opened her arms and embraced him. "That is amazing news. Does Marie have it?"
I just emailed it to her. She'll probably have read it by Tuesday morning, knowing the speed she works at.
Do you think she'll ask for many changes?
We'll have to see. It's my first novel, after all. I think I'm happy with it. Some days I read it and I think it's the best thing I've ever written. Some days I want to rewrite the whole thing from scratch.
"I'm sure it's perfect," the wife said, looking up at him, her long blonde hair flowing behind her back. Normally she wore it in a ponytail, but today...
Did you know her?
Howard said. The old man frowned, and Howard couldn't tell if it was due to the interruption or if he was trying to think how to answer the question.
It's just that you speak about her like you really do know her, and you're recounting conversations like you've been there.
There was a lengthy pause before the man cleared his throat and resumed speaking. There were very few changes to be made, thankfully. The day the book was released, the writer received his paycheck and he took himself and his wife to Thailand for 2 weeks, where they engaged in food, wine, reading, and relaxation. His wife banned him from checking the internet on his phone, so he couldn't read any reviews of his work. He was allowed to text family and friends, but other than that, access was barred. The reaction to his book remained on his mind all week, to the point where at times he was staying up until the early hours of the morning, practically writing negative reviews in his head, stressing about the fictional sentences and opinions that were not even remotely his own. When he got back, it took him all of 5 minutes to read the reviews. Most were positive. They said it was a fine read, nothing groundbreaking, but was perfectly acceptable for a first novel. The writer acknowledged these criticisms but struggled to agree with them. He didn't consider his work perfect, but a 3 out of 5 rating, which was the general consensus, was harsher than he had hoped.
Fine.
He told himself.
We'll do better with the next one.
Before he could even consider devoting another few years of his life to a second novel, he came across a review written by a small-time blogger dubbing themselves The Critic. For a writer with such a definitive title, the writer had never heard of this person before. The critic's blog was sparse, just a single post reviewing the writer's novel. The writer could never recall how he stumbled across it, but when reading it, it impacted him like no other review had. It was a scathing, malicious, and directed attack on him and his work. The writer read it several times over, angered by the words. He certainly has no sense of characterization, his protagonist defined by his dedication to the job, the villain lacking any sense of motivation, and all his female characters are morons, aimlessly there to give droves of exposition and become as forgettable as this writer soon will be.
You remembered it like you wrote it.
Howard said. The old man said nothing. The writer was furious. He wrote a reply to the critic's blog, demanding he apologize. The writer could accept criticism, but this critique was personal, like this anonymous blogger had a grudge against him and was lambasting the work purely because of its author. The writer knew what he was doing was wrong. The critic probably wanted this kind of reaction out of him, but he felt he had to respond. His reply was one of fury, written with true anger. He never stooped so low as to insult the critic's character, but derided them for such a harsh and unnecessary review. He sent it off, and waited, and waited, and waited. The writer kept checking his email continuously. Every time his email chimed, he rushed to see if the critic had replied, but it was only the writer's agent or promotions from various websites he had vowed to unsubscribe 2 years ago. He would do that soon. Days went by, weeks. Soon it was months, and the world had forgotten about the writer and his debut novel. The writer had almost forgotten about the critic, but every now and then, when he considered starting a second book, the critic's words resonated in the back of his mind. This anonymous blogger was beginning to haunt him. Every now and again he checked the critic's blog to see if there was any kind of update or apology. There was nothing. The only post the critic had ever made was to scathe the writer's work. Then, one seemingly innocuous day, when he hadn't thought about the critic for over a week, the writer casually checked his emails and saw a reply. He immediately opened the email. The critic had responded with a simple word. Enjoy. The word linked to our website, and the writer clicked on it immediately. It took him to the critic's blog, which now had another post added to it. The writer let out a moan of horror. The critic had taken screenshots of the writer's email and posted them online to a grand audience. A conversation between two people was now providing commentary for millions more. The critic had baited him entirely. It wasn't long before the national news picked it up. God knows how they found it. Evidently, the critic had chosen a slow news day to attack. The writer wondered if they had waited on purpose. Surely no one holds a grudge for such a long period of time. What had he done to irk this man so much? The writer knew he hadn't stuck the landing with his debut, but no one deserved such a vitriolic attack. He sat down, much to the cries of his wife and to his own mind, and replied,
And that marks the end of the writer's story, although he is still to play a prominent part in the second part of our tale.
The critic's phone made a little ding, notifying him that his inbox was one email bigger. The little 1 in a red circle visually indicated this. Somehow, the critic knew what it was, as new emails were a rare occasion for them. Opening the app proved the critic right. It was the writer, the one provoked by the critic's words, and was now reacting to the posting of his own angry worded email. This time, however, the writer had taken a simplistic approach to querying the critic's review, and replied with just one word.
Why?
The critic smirked. That was far easier reading than the last email from the writer, or even the drivel the writer and some so-called literary knowledgeable reviewers had called a novel. The critic pocketed the phone and carried on with their day.
The critic.
Howard said,
Is it a he or a she?
You seem fixated on trivial details.
Do I know Clarissa? What's the critic's sex? What phone does the critic have? These are irrelevant to the story.
Clarissa, is that the wife?
It doesn't matter.
The old man said hurriedly.
She's no longer a part of this story.
There were no emails on the critic's phone for a couple of days, and they lived their life in peace. On a Tuesday morning, however,
That's oddly specific.
the app made another ding, waking the critic up. The critic saw it was another reply from the writer. Some may have mistaken it for a computer error, for it was the exact same email sent days prior. "Why" stood alone as the only text. The critic knew the writer had retyped this and sent it again purposefully. The critic again ignored the email, leaving the writer to his own imagination. In this time, national news outlets had picked up the images the critic had posted and had talked at end at the writer's response to the initial review. It displayed immaturity, a lack of self-confidence, and extreme pettiness. The writer had had to turn off the news, and he kept to himself for many months. He locked himself in his study, doing all he could to search for the identity of the critic. He ignored all requests for interviews, even when they offered him inordinate amounts of money just for an hour of his time. His agent tried to contact him, but he shut her off. Friends and family, they too got lost in the culling of society. His wife stood by him for as long as she could, but she could not accept this newfound lifestyle forever. All the while, the critic ignored the writer's emails for months. The writer never wrote another book, but every day at 11 a.m. he emailed the critic with "Why?" without fail. Religiously, the critic's phone dinged as the email shot through. Each day, the critic looked to see if there was any variation in the writer's email, but there was none. Before long, the months turned to years, and soon it had become over a decade. Then, almost 11 years to the day the writer's work was published, the critic's email made one final ding. The critic checked, and "Why" was nowhere to be seen. Instead, 2 words,
Let's meet.
followed by an address and a time, 1 week from now. The critic knew exactly where it was. The critic had never been to the house of a famous writer, but 1 week from today, the critic would finally meet the writer where he had written his very first and very last novel. The critic turned up 2 minutes early. They rang the doorbell. It was an adequate house, separated from the others on the street. It was 1 a.m, and no one else was out at this time. The critic heard shuffling, and the door opened to reveal the writer to the critic, and the critic to the writer. 11 years ago, the writer had been a rather handsome man. Once wavy blonde hair was matted and unkempt. Facial hair grew rampant over his face that could have belonged to a model had he chosen another profession. His black leather jacket was frayed, and his trousers were stained with something or other. "So, we finally meet," the critic said. "How are you, my favourite writer?"
Why did you do it?
The writer asked, ignoring the critic's words. "I wrote nothing that you had not already considered yourself," the critic said back.
You ruined my life.
The writer said.
I spent years in that book, and you turned the one thing I've ever been proud of into something that made me lose everything.
"I heard your wife left you," the critic said, "and that she is remarried. But I struggle to see how this is my fault." It was then that the critic noticed the writer was holding a gun in his left hand. "That's an interesting method," the critic said, "but it will not change anything." It was a short encounter between the 2 men, one that lasted a brief minute and ended in the way that most tragic of stories go. Neighbours heard yelling from the writer's residence and alerted the police after hearing a single gunshot. Emergency services arrived immediately, but it was too late. They found a single body and no sign of a culprit.
Who died?
I cannot recall.
That seems like a pivotal part of the story. How can you not remember which one of them died?
My memory gets hazy.
The old man said. He slid off of his bar stool and pulled on his coat in one slow motion.
And that is the end.
No, it can be. You can't end a story like that. There's no resolution, no answers.
I just did.
The old man said, moving towards the stairs. Howard watched him walk away, his mind whirring with possibilities of who the writer could have been, the identity of the critic, and how the old man tied into all of this.
Wait.
Howard said.
Which one were you? The writer or the critic? To have that much detail of the writer's life, the critic's emails, their meeting, you had to have been one of them.
The old man shook his head.
You figure it out.
With that, he finished the climb up the stairs and disappeared from view. A part of Howard wanted to go after the old man, to interrogate him for a definitive answer, but he knew that by the time he had got to the top of the stairs, the old man surely would have vanished.
And thus ends another exciting episode of Where the Grass is Always Grayer. And remember to tune in to our next broadcast with all your favourite commentary provided by your most generous host, Mr. Greene. That's me, if you're wondering. The voice you're hearing right now? Me. That's Mr. Greene. You. Yes, you. Who's Mr. Greene? You weren't paying attention. So come on. Who's Mr. Greene? I'm Mr. Greene. I am Mr. Greene. No, I'm not Howard Gnarly.